2 weeks ago, we talked about the 50th anniversary of Stonewall. The Stonewall uprising was that uprising in a gay bar in the village of New York, led primarily by transgendered folks and drag queens. It really was the beginning, or at least credited as one of the beginnings, of the current gay liberation movement. We talked about what that meant. The Liturgical Arts Ministries had made an incredible altar. How many people were here that day, just so I get a sense? Okay, many of you. They made a beautiful artistic piece on the altar of bricks and beer bottles and all kinds of things, really representing the signs of defiance and of what would be liberation during those moments. So the altar was dressed like that. It was very moving to me. That following Monday morning, I walked out of my house, and my neighbors were there, and they said, "Hey, Penny, a really good friend of ours visited your church yesterday." I said, "Great." And they said, "Well, she has a child the same age as ours." And I said, "Oh, you mean so-and-so?" Because I happened to meet the person and remember. And they said, "Yes, she loved it. She loved your church." I said, "Great." We talked a little bit, and at the end I said, "Hey, you guys should come sometime. We're really open." And they said, we heard there was beer on the altar." Then they said, "Now that's a church we could go to." So have we become scandalous? I hope so. Have we become gluttonous? Maybe. Because if we have, we're in good company with the one whose teachings we follow. Jesus most often used the term to describe himself, Son of Man. And if I were to ask you to fill in the blank, the Son of Man came what? Well, you might say to seek and to save the lost. You might say to heal people. But I doubt that many of us would have said, the Son of Man came eating and drinking. So what's the context for Jesus self-describing this way? Well, John the Baptist was in prison. And John the Baptist had disciples just like Jesus had disciples. In fact, John the Baptist was a very powerful and prominent person, somewhat marginalized, but everybody knew about him. He was in prison. So John's disciples came to Jesus and said, "Jesus, are you the one that we're waiting for? Or should we expect someone else? Because we need to tell John, because he's sitting in prison primarily because of you. So is this worth it?" And Jesus says, "Go back and tell John what you see and what you hear. The blind see, the lame walk. Good news is preached to the poor, and blessed is the one who takes no offense." So John's disciples go back, and then Jesus begins to speak about the crowd. That's where we pick up the story today. Jesus begins to speak about the crowd. And he says to them, "What did you expect when you went out to see John the Baptist? Somebody in fine robes? That would be in a palace. Did you expect a prophet? Or did you not expect a prophet to look like that?" And then he says, basically, what is it going to take with you people? What's it going to take with this generation? We play the flute, nobody dances. We cry, nobody wails with us. In other words, what will it take to move you? Or do you really want to be moved? Because, Jesus says, John the Baptist came, not eating, not drinking, and you said he had a demon. But I'm coming, eating and drinking, and now what do you say about me? That I'm a glutton and a drunkard, a friend of tax collectors and sinners. I think what Jesus was criticizing, in a way he was saying, look, we just can't get it right. You know why? Because people, all of us, we're experts at judgments, aren't we? Oh my gosh. We all got opinions, disguised as judgments. You know, 2 weeks ago, that same week, Dave Chandler, our moderator, held a moderators forum. And he began by saying, I just want to tell you some of the comments I get so that you can kind of, hear what's going on. So he said, people come to me like about worship. People say, there's too much music. Another person says, there's not enough music. And then Dave kind of did this litany, right, of how we are as people, basically. How we are as people. What Jesus was criticizing in that moment was the wrong emphasis that people put on religious things. Rituals are very important. We'll share one today. But rituals are only as powerful and meaningful as the faith and intention that we bring to them. Otherwise, they're meaningless and empty. Piety, for piety's sake. What does it lead to? Usually, self-righteousness. And we know that religious people can be the most bigoted people. Now, but Jesus, referring to himself as gluttonous in a way, that offends our sensibilities. But I think he's trying to shift perspective. Abundant life is not about a list of shoulds and shouldn'ts. In a way, this teacher is saying, if you're going to have faith, faith must be deeply rooted in the everyday. Where you live, how you treat others. There was an article in the paper at the very end of August in the New York Times by Timothy Egan, who's a great op-ed columnist and author, and it was entitled, Why People Hate Religion. And he says, so yes, he talks about charlatans and people that take a lot of money from people in religion. But he says, so yes, people hate religion when the loudest proponents of religion are shown to be mercenaries for a leader who debases everything he touches. And yes, young people are leaving the pews in droves because too often the person facing them in those pews is a fraud. Talking about my kind here. They hate religion because at a moment to stand up and be counted on the right side of history, religion is used as a moral cover for despicable behavior. That is not new to our age. Hitler got a pass from the Vatican until very late in the war. Jesus was referring to himself as eating and drinking, while true on many levels, because he meant to provoke people into thinking about their religion and maybe invite them to a more earthly spirituality. You ever heard that saying of a religious person? They're so heavenly minded, they're of no earthly good. Jesus had a way of shifting people's perspective, and he did it by a simple strategy: eating. Eating with people. Robert Karras says, in Luke's gospel, Jesus is either going to a meal, at a meal, or coming from a meal. And when he is not eating, Jesus' parables and teachings are all about food. In general, Jesus was a foodie. He'd fit in very well here. He was about feasting, not fasting. He would have fit very well in the Bay Area. And I remind us all that in the Gospel of John, his first miracle was what? Turning water into wine. He also loved him some wine, apparently. And what a great startup, turning water into wine. Jesus was communicating, teaching that engaged and earthly spirituality happens around a table, that meals are acts of companionship. In fact, the word companion is from the Latin word cum, which means with or together, and the Latin word pan, which means bread. Companion is breaking bread together. And is it any wonder that our main rite, the core sacrament Jesus left us with, what we now call communion or the Eucharist, is a simple meal, the sharing of the meal. Jesus said, I am in the bread and I am in the wine because love is shared at a meal. Community is made and welcome is embodied. Our two most basic needs come together, food and companionship. And this is at the heart of our faith. That's where I am, Jesus says. For a time in my house where I grew up, there was a sign, Christ is the head of this home, the unseen guest at every meal, the silent listener to every conversation. Now, admittedly, it did feel a little big brotherish to me, but it can be interpreted another way. Where two or three are gathered, where a meal is shared, there is always the possibility of God showing up. Meals themselves can be sacramental, where we encounter the divine, where grace enters. And when we clink glasses on a cheer or to a l'chaim, we look in each other's eyes and make that connection, that holy moment. Native American poet Joy Harrow says it this way, the world begins at a kitchen table. No matter what, we must eat to live, and the gifts of earth are brought and prepared, set on the table. So it has been since creation, and so it shall go on. Think for a moment about your own tables, where stories are told, romance begins, friendships are forged, barriers are crossed. So much of our living gets done around tables. You know what? It could be, this eating thing could be revolutionary. If we offered hospitality in the places of hostility, what a different world it would be. Tables can be exclusive, and we'll talk about that later on in this series. But at the heart of our faith, the table, sharing meals together, is meant to be an embodiment of love, a way to break down the boundaries, to cross the barriers socially of race, of class, of gender, of political affiliation and religious affinities. This is what Jesus did. Okay, now hear me now. Who he ate with was what made him scandalous. He was gluttonous, not because he ate too much, but because he loved too much. The gluttony was not an excess of food, but an excess of grace. That's why I invite us into a gluttonous spirituality. I would rather be called scandalous and gluttonous than to be so heavenly minded I am no earthly good, wouldn't you? I'll end with this because we're going into communion. It's from a book called the Coromila Prayer Book. This is a Catholic setting. And he says this, a few years ago at Mass, I was sitting near a woman who had a small boy on her lap. He looked to be about 3 years old. It was an ordinary Sunday Mass and an ordinary child. At the time of the consecration, the faithful were quiet, the bell was rung, the priest held up the sacrament, and everything was as expected. Then the child, who up to now had been quiet, shouted out, "Hello, Jesus." He dragged the hello out into one long yodel, and everybody in the church turned. Well, like many children and adults, he knew an audience when he had one. So he said it even louder and longer, "Hello, Jesus." It was a moment of delight. The priest looked shocked, as if Jesus had turned up in the actual flesh and bone. Keep that child quiet, you could see in everybody's fear. Theologically, of course, the child was deliciously correct. The woman holding the small boy looked mildly embarrassed, but mostly thrilled. And I cannot remember, he says, anything else apart from that Mass except the warm welcome of a small child who took the story seriously. The small child whose words of welcome were the surprise of praise among the predictable. So if you want to, when Jorge holds up the bread later, I dare you. But it sure would be great if the everydayness of our lives, we could expect for God to show up. And we could be ready and open and available to that in whatever way is meaningful to us. And if we can join in the strategy of simply eating together and seeing each other. Amen.